Okay, thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone again for being here so late in the afternoon. So very quickly about myself, as was just mentioned, I'm actually fairly new to the world of EA. I only joined the Environmental Assessment Agency in August of this year. The Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, for those who don't know, reports to the Minister of the Environment in Canada as part of the federal government system. We're effectively a mini department, if you will, of environmental assessment that's responsible to help with the implementation of our Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. So I work on policy issues there. Climate change is an obvious one of them. I was struck by one of the comments that we heard this morning from the All Board conference, some of the key lessons that they discussed, one of them being the need to have stronger integration with the climate change community. So I guess the agency went one step better and actually went and hired someone from the climate change policy world to come and do EA policy. So it's been an interesting transition for me. Page down, we'll do this. Good. So how are we doing in Canada on integrating climate change in EA? So I thought I would contrast two different quotes from studies, papers written by people who are attending this conference. I don't think either of them are in the room. Mr. Dr. Arguwala, in the OECD work, says that actually Canada is doing pretty well, probably furthest along in recognition of climate change consideration in EIA. Mr. Hazel, on the other hand, says that actually we've not been doing so well after all. So an interesting contrast in perspectives, and which is right? We'll explore that a little bit, and I invite you to draw your own conclusions, and maybe I'll contribute to them a little. First, I'm sort of obligated to make sure you all understand the Government of Canada takes the issue of climate change very seriously. We support an approach to climate change that achieves real environmental and economic benefits for all Canadians. Of course, as someone who spent the last couple of years working on developing a core piece of what would have been a national cap-and-trade system in Canada, where our minister was very clear recently on making sure people understood that our economy is so integrated with the American economy in particular that it makes no sense to proceed with on climate change without making sure we're carefully aligning our policies, principles, and regulations and standards. And so that's the exercise that we've been currently engaged in. This may draw some of your minds to some of the comments that were made this morning about the role of this particular country where we're in now and what actions they're taking and the spillover effects, but you can think to that on your own. We do have a target that we aligned with the U.S. target in the Copenhagen Accord by 2020 to reduce our national overall greenhouse gas emissions by 17% from 2005 levels, which is aligned with the U.S. target. What are some of the things that we're doing? This slide is a little bit small, but three of the main areas on terms of reducing GHG emissions is worth pointing out. We have announced an intention to regulate the coal-fired electricity generation starting in 2015, where we will bring in regulations to impose tough performance standards on new coal-fired generation and also on units that are no longer of economic value. Some definitions of those things are still being worked out and how that will be implemented. There's been consultations underway with key stakeholders that will be affected, provincial governments in Canada, where coal is an important part of the electricity mix. But the goal is certainly that we'll encourage electric utilities to transition towards low and non-emitting types of generation, including carbon capture and storage. We've got regulations on renewable fuels, 5% content in gasoline for ethanol, and also a plan for 2% of in distillates and diesel fuel for biodiesel, and that there's no date on the second target yet. Transportation measures, we've also announced harmonizing our standards with the ones that are happening down here in the U.S. And also it's important, we sometimes forget to point out that we are acting on adaptation. We actually have a fairly broad suite of program measures that were funded a few years ago. 5 different federal departments got some funds to try and, on adaptation, really the game has been much more about trying to build capacity, build awareness of understanding what some of the impacts are, what some of the possible adaptation measures are that can be taken, work being done to build collaboration across different regions, tools for adaptation, some money on modeling and downscaling, those sorts of things for the scenarios work, some work on health, especially a focus on the north and where we expect to see some significant impacts of climate change in Aboriginal communities, for example. So that's an area that we've been acting on in Canada. So all those things being said, so why are we here? Why are we interested in possibly integrating climate change in EA? I'll come to in a few minutes speaking about this set of 2003 guidelines that have been mentioned a couple of times that we have in place in Canada. But they do provide a nice little summary of what some of the reasons are of why this is an important issue. What do we want to get out of this? Well, we want to make sure that the EA process contributes to our broader climate change policy. But also we want to make sure of take advantage of the opportunity for the EA process to raise awareness of the potential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from projects that are subject to an EA, stimulate some thinking about less emission-intensive ways to do business, and also to consider the impacts, to help see force is not the right word, to stimulate the consideration of what sorts of adaptation measures can be taken. In projects that are going to be subject to a changing climate. And also, very importantly, from a government perspective, making sure that the public understands that climate change is a factor and is being considered as we make these decisions that allow projects to go ahead. So I have one, I think, real success story. I think it's a blossoming or burgeoning or unfolding success story, we hope, on strategic EA in the Government of Canada. We recently, just last month, the Minister of the Environment tabled the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. It basically sets out an integrated government-wide approach to environment sustainability on a broad different range of environmental issues in Canada. It includes federal goals, targets, and implementation strategies to address, well, it's set out under 4 different themes, and they're the 4 obvious culprits, if you will. Climate change and air quality as one, also water issues, the nature of biodiversity issues, and then government operations. For climate change, we specifically set out, again, and this wraps up the already existing target that we had set, that we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Canada relative to 2005 by 17% by 2020.